Hello everyone. In this video we will be exploring the process of creating basic prototype textures, 3D models, and then we'll turn those created resources into assets that we will then be able to use in the Godot GridMap node. In order to accomplish this goal, we will be utilizing Gimp, Blender, and Godot. We will start out by using Gimp to create prototype textures for floor and wall meshes, and then we will transition to using Blender, where we will create a 3D mesh kit containing our floors and walls. Finally, we will import and convert our 3D mesh kit into a resource that we can utilize with the Godot GridMap node. So let's get creating. Let's start with creating our grid texture. So open up Gimp, and once you have Gimp open, let's go ahead and create a new image that we'll use for our texture. I'm going to set this to 1024 by 1024 to make it a square texture. Other settings are fine, so click OK. Hold Control, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit just so it's easier to see. So what I want to do is I want to stay organized, and you do that by working with your layers. So over here on the layers section, if you double click, you can change the name to background color, and then click OK, and now it's renamed. So they're either way. So now that we've got the layer renamed to the proper layer, we want to pick a color to change the background to. So click on the color, and we're going to change it to 2D, 2D, 2D to make a nice gray, and press enter. And then we're going to hit OK. It's going to make a nice dark gray. Next, you want to click on the bucket, fill, and then click in the background and change the background color. So now we've got the background color changed. We want to start creating the grid lines. So we want to create a new layer. So we're going to click create new layer. And we're going to call this one grid. Alright, grid. So we're going to call it grid. And then you need to go up to create that grid, you click filters. You go down to render, pattern, and grid. So just with the grid, we want to make 2 grids. And this will be for lining things up in our 3D space, make things easier. But we want to change this to be 510. And we want both of those to be 510. And we want the line width to be 4. Just making sure that it's 4. Alright. And then we want to change the color to white. We're going to hit OK. And then we're going to hit OK. And you can see it made our quarter grid. And then now that we have our grid into quarters, we want to go to create another layer. And we want, it's 8, but we want grid 8. So we're going to make a smaller grid. So we've got our main grid and our smaller one. So hit filters again, render, pattern, grid. And so this grid, we want it to be 255, 255. And we want to change the color again to be white. And we want the line width to be 1. Make a smaller, lighter grid, as you can see. And then we're going to hit OK. So now, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got 4, 8 on each section. So that's 16. So anyways, we divided it equally into 16. So the next thing we want to do is to add some descriptive text. So we're going to click the text tool, but first I want to change this color back to white so that when we're working with the text tool, we'll be able to do that. So click the text tool, and then we want to change the options on the text tool. So I use audio wide, but I'm sure that's a font that not many people have. So let's use a font that comes pre with Gimp most of the time. But you can use any font you want. I'm going to use Deja Vu, and then it's serif. Deja Vu serif. Font is the one that I want. We're going to make it 32 pixels in size, and again we want to make sure that the color is set to white. So if you hold down the left click and then drag, so we want to left click and drag where we're going to place our text, and we'll go ahead and let go once we're done. Then you can click inside the text box and start typing. So I'm going to call this texture my floor texture. I'm going to leave a space, and then I want it. My texture is going to represent 1 meter by 1 meter. And in my 1 meter by 1 meter world, we know the texture is 1024 by 1024. So when we see this in our world, we'll know that a texture of 1024 by 1024 represents 1 meter by 1 meter. Okay. So once we've entered our descriptive text, we are going to you can press escape to get out. So we have our descriptive text. So we are now going to export this texture. So if you go up and you click save as, well, there's two things. So if you hit save or save as, all it's going to do is save the current project you're working on, which is fine. So let's do that first. So let's save as. And then I'm going to find my tutorial folder. Okay, so I wanted my tutorial folder, and I'm going to create this texture. So this is going to be in the base. We'll call it floor grid texture. And we'll go ahead and save. Now that saved our project, but we want to export this as either like a PNG or a JPG or some other image file. So in order to export this as an image, you go up to export as, and now we can call it a grid texture, and we'll do it as a PNG. But we want to also add color descriptor just to keep track of things. So we're going to have a gray floor texture, and then we're going to click export, export again. So now we have our floor texture created. So now we want to change some things on the texture, and we're going to create a second texture that will be used for our wall, and we want it to differentiate between our floor and our wall by using different colors and different text description. So we're going to click on the background color layer, and then we want to change our color picker to a different color, and then we're going to pick an orange color, 06E00. So C06E00. Press enter, and it's going to give us this generic orangey color. And then we're going to click our bucket fill tool, and we're just going to click, and that'll automatically change that to be our background color. So next we want to modify the text. So if you click on the text layer and then the text tool, then you can click inside. I will change this from floor to wall so that we can tell the difference between the two. And now that we've got it changed to wall, go ahead and press escape and go up to File, Export As, and we want to make sure that we're going to call this wall so that we don't overwrite what we did for our floor. And then we want to change the color of this to orange. And then we're going to click Export and Export. And that is it. You can also hit Save to save our changes from floor to texture. And now we've got our project saved and we have our two textures. Here is the floor grid texture and the wall grid texture. And next we will work on creating the Blender mesh models for our prototype grid mesh. Now we're going to start off our tutorial by creating our models for our mesh kit that will later import into Godot. So starting out, we're going to start by creating a model for the floor, then we're going to create a model for the wall. We're going to apply textures, organize them, and save them into an exportable format. So let's get started. So in order to create a floor model, first thing you want to do to make your life easier is starting with a clean Blender project. Go ahead and select all of the objects by pressing A, and then press delete on the keyboard so that we start with a clean slate. And then we're going to now add back in, I know, delete it just to add it, but I'm going to add back in a cube by pressing Shift A and selecting Mesh. So now we want to manipulate the cube, and we're going to press in to open the transformation menu. And under the transformation menu, we're going to enter 1 meter for X and Y, and we want to make it 0.2 meters thick for the floor. The reason we're doing a cube instead of a plane is that a cube with thickness add a collision, or tell Blender to add a auto-generated collision object, will have the collision work on both sides of the floor. It'll work on the top and the bottom. If you make it a plane, the collision becomes directional in one way. So if you have the tile flipped, when you add it into the game, you'll fall through the tile. Now what we want to do is make sure that the cube is selected. So we're going to push A if you clicked off. But anyways, so press Control A, and we want apply all transforms. This will make it so that whatever scaling we did applies as 111, so the scale will always be 111 and the location will be 000, even though we modified it with our change in the dimensions. So now we want to move down the floor by 0.1 of a meter so that the floor is flush with the ground, basically. So we're gonna, when we import, so we want G on the keyboard, Z, and then enter -0.1, press enter, and that'll move it down. Should zoom in on that. That'll move it down 0.1. So now we want to again press Control A and apply all transforms, and you'll see it applied the location change for that. So next we want to name our floor piece, so press F2 and enter the name floor grid and add at the end of it -COL. So the -COL at the end of the name tells Blender when you're exporting it to apply a collision object to the mesh. So if you don't want to automatically have a collision object applied to the mesh, just leave off the -COL at the end. Press enter to save the name. You can also change the name up here in the scene collection if you need to. So now we're going to move on to applying a texture to our floor. So in order to apply the texture, go up to the Shading tab and click Shading. And it may take a minute or two to switch, depending upon the speed of your computer. So, to move around, you can hold down Shift and middle mouse click, or you'll have to adjust the settings for if you don't have a scroll wheel. So let me make sure that my screencast is set. There we go. Okay, so now that we're on the Shading tab, what we're going to do is go over to the material settings, and we want to click on the browse material, linked material, and choose material. And then we're going to change the name of the material to floor grid material. Press enter, save the name change. So now that we've changed the name of the shader, we want to add a new texture image. So we created the textures in the previous tutorial, so we're going to now use those textures. So if you hit Shift A and go down to texture and image texture, and now left click to set the image texture box in the shader node tree. So what we're going to do is open and browse to GridMap texture. So we have two textures. We have our floor grid and our wall grid. We're going to start with our floor grid gray texture and then click open image. we're going to change linear to closest, and then we're going to connect the color from the color to the base color. And now we can see that it's started to apply our texture. So next we need to adjust the UV coordinates so that the texture displays properly on our mesh. So go up to the UV editing tab and click UV editing. And you can see our texture here has the default UV texture coordinates. So what we want to do is over here, so that we can see the changes on our mesh, we're going to press Z and choose Material Preview. So now you'll be able to barely see it in this, but you can see that it's starting to apply the texture, and so that we can see the changes as we go. So choose and make sure you're in edit mode. You can change modes by pressing tab. So we want to go up to change it to face mode, and you can do that by pressing 3 on your keyboard. 1, 2, and 3 represents the vertices, edges, and faces. So once you've gone into face mode, you want to select the top face, hold shift, and, well, first hold down the middle scroll wheel and rotate under, and then hold shift and left click the bottom face. So now that you have both the top and the bottom face selected. And then now you want to come over to your UV editor, and you want to press A to select all of the UV coordinates. And then you can go up to the UV menu and click UV Unwrap. I'm going to find it first. Unwrap. UV Unwrap and Cube Projection. And that will map the floor texture in the top there. So now we want to, as you can see, in the default view, the texture is rotated. You could leave it like this and just rotate it in Godot, or we can rotate it so that it's consistent within the Blender grid kit. So in order to rotate, you press, while pointing over here on the UV coordinates, press R, type 90, and press enter to rotate the points. And you can see now that the floor is rotated to the proper spots. So next we will, now that we've applied the texture to both the bottom and the top, and the grids line up, we'll leave the sides as default. You can actually change those if you need to get the grid lines along the edges, but we're going to keep it just as the divided edge there. So next up, we are going to organize the floor, start organizing our mesh so that it can be exported as a grid kit. And now that we switched to the layout tab, we are now going to press Z and choose material preview so that we can see the floor texture while we're organizing and moving the texture around. Press left click on the floor object. If you're not in object mode, make sure you press tab to switch from edit mode to object mode, or choose object mode from the drop down. And make sure that you have the floor selected by left clicking on it. Next, we want to press M to create a new collection and click New Collection. And then we want to rename this to row 1. So organizing the grid mesh of the floor into an exportable row. And as we add more meshes, we can organize them by row or by a name. For me, it's easier to organize them by the name of row 1, row 2, etc. But you may choose a more descriptive name. It just helps me organize. So click OK, and you'll see that the floor grid has been moved into the row 1 collection. So now we want to move the floor grid into its final position where it'll be so that it'll get exported properly. So press G, and we want to move it in the X, so X coordinate, so press X, and then press minus 2.5 to move it back 2.5 meters from the origin, and then press enter to accept the changes. We want to then press G again to grab the floor, Y to move on the Y axis, and 0.5 to move the floor over by 0.5 of a meter. Press enter to accept the changes, and you can see now that the floor is properly centered within the 1x1 grid square. So next we will create a wall model object. So as we did for the floor mesh, we're now going to do for the wall mesh. So press Shift A, go down to mesh and choose cube to create a new cube for the wall. We're going back to our dimensions, and if you don't have your dimensions open, you can press N to pop out the transform menu and then press item. So we're going to modify the dimensions of the wall of the X to be 0.1 meters, and we want the Y and the Z to each be 1 meter to make our wall. Next, we want to take our wall and we want to move it back so that it is half on or into the proper plane. We want to move it up. So press G, and we want to move it up along the Z axis. So enter 0.5 to move it up half a meter, and then press enter to accept the move. And that way the floor is now going to be, or the wall is going to be flush with the floor. So again, now that we've moved its location, we're going to press Control A and choose all transforms to apply the transforms. You can choose individually the transforms that you want to apply, but for me it's just easier to just do all. But in other instances you may not want to do that. So we are going to press F2 to rename cube, and we're going to call it wall grid column, and again the column is to have Blender auto generate a collision object when we later import into Godot. Press enter and you'll see the name is changed up the scene collection. So next we're going to apply a texture to our wall just like we did with the floor. So in order to apply our texture to our wall object, we need to switch back to the shading tab so that now we have both the floor and the wall in order to shade it. So now we want to click New under the material properties, And this material we want to rename to be wall grid material and press enter. So in the shader node tree, we want to press Shift A and choose texture and image texture, and then you can move and left click to apply the image texture, just like we did for the floor, we're doing for the wall. We're going to click open, and we're going to browse to textures that we created, and we choose the wall grid texture this time instead of the floor texture, and click open image. We're again going to change it from linear to closest, and we're going to then connect the color output of the texture to the base color of the wall. And now we have to modify again the UV coordinates for the wall texture. So click on UV editing tab. And we have the same problem that we had for the floor, but this time we're going to choose the front and the back. So we want to, in edit mode and face select, click the front face, rotate around, hold shift, and click the back face. Make sure both the front and the back face are selected. And then we're going to press A in the UV editor to select all of the UV coordinates. We're going to click UV, unwrap, and cube projection, just like we did for the floor. So now we're going to organize the wall grid, just like we did with floor grid, into the proper placement on the row for exporting. So to do that, let's switch back to our layout tab and make sure that our wall object is selected, not our floor, and that we're in object mode. We're going to press M, and we're going to choose row 1 to move the wall grid underneath the same row as the floor. We're going to now move the floor into its final position by pressing G, X, and we want to move it back 0.5 meters back, and press enter. And then now that we've moved the wall back by 5 meters, we're going to press Control A because we want to apply this change so that the wall will wind up on halfway on the edge of the floor, as you'll see here in a second. So press Control A and choose all transforms to apply this transformation to the floor or to the wall. Next, we want to press G to grab the wall, X to move it back, and we want to move it back by minus 2.5 meters. And now you can see, zoom in for a second, you can see that the wall is halfway there. So next we want to move the wall over to the right. So we're going to press G, going to press Y, and we want to move it over by a whole 2.5 meters. So you'll see that the dot, the rotation point of the wall, is centered and the wall is back onto our line This will allow us to overlap walls and floors nicely when we export our grid mesh. So next we're going to work on exporting our floor and wall prototype grid meshes for importing into Godot. So now that we're going to, in order to export the prototype grid kit, we need to first make sure that all of our objects that we want to export are selected. So press A to select all and make sure that you're in object mode. Then go up to File, Export, and choose GLTF 2.0 to export. Export your mesh and then rename file to be prototype grid kit.glb. On the right, you want to expand, include, and choose selected objects for the export settings. And you can, if you want to, choose to remember the export settings, which I'm going to go ahead and do that. So the next time I try to export, it'll remember the changes that I made, or you can just always make the change. And click Export GLTF 2.0. So now you have successfully created your grid mesh prototype kit and can export and have exported into a format that is able to be imported into a grid mesh in Godot. Next, we're going to start setting up the folder structure for the Godot portion of the tutorial. Let's get started. So in your file system, over here on the left-hand side, you want to right-click and choose Create New Folder. I'm going to call this folder Assets. In the Assets folder, we're going to store our images later. We also want to add a folder, create another folder, and we'll call this one Scenes. And this is how I like to organize my projects, but you organize it the way that makes sense for you. But I like to separate my scenes and scripts and assets. So I'm going to create another folder and we'll call this one Scripts. And now that we've got the main folders underneath assets, I want to create a subfolder. So right click the asset folder, create new folder. And this one we're going to call Mesh Libraries. Click OK. Press enter. Under assets, we want to create yet another folder. And we'll call this one Models. And I'll expand this just so you can see Mesh Libraries, Models. And then underneath Models, I want to create one more folder, and we'll call this Prototype Grid. And then click OK. So when you're done, your tree structure should look or your file tree structure should look like mine. So next up, we're going to import the Blender assets that we created in the previous tutorial. So in order to import the Blender assets that we created, the prototype grid kit GLB file from Blender, first you want to make sure that you have the prototype grid folder highlighted, and then on your computer you want to use your file system and browse to where you've stored or saved the prototype grid kit.glb file. Then you want to select this file and you want to drag it over and left click and release on the prototype grid folder. And when you do that, you'll see underneath the folder that it created the GLB and your two textures. So next we're going to create the actual mesh library within Godot. In order to create the mesh library, we're going to first right click on the imported prototype gridkit.glb file and choose new inherited scene. So the new inherited scene, you'll see that it automatically imported our floor and our wall, and it also added collision boxes to the scene. So next we want to take our scene and we want to click scene and then save scene as. And then you want to double click on the scenes folder and enter in for the name prototype. Well, it automatically enters it, but if you want to, you can change the name of the scene. I'm going to stick with the default name of prototype gridkit.tscn. So click save to save the scene. And next we're going to convert our placeholder scene. I like to have this placeholder scene so that when later I'm importing and making changes to the mesh kit, I can update this and it'll update the rest in the system. So this just makes sure that it's working right. So in order to export this, go up to Scene and choose Export as Mesh Library. And then we want to go into the Assets folder, Mesh Libraries, and we're going to enter for the file name prototype grid kit mesh library, and leave the default here and then click save. Now you'll have in your mesh libraries this prototype grid mesh library. And the next thing we want to do is we want to, now that we have our mesh library, turn it into a grid map. So in order to create our grid map, we want to start by creating a template scene that we're going to use for demonstrating the grid map. So go up to your scenes and click new scene from your scene menu, and then choose 3D scene to create a new 3D scene. We'll click scene, save scene as, and make sure you're in the scenes folder. And we're going to change the name of this scene to level template, and then click save. I want to double click on the node 3D to rename it, and I want to rename it the same as my scene name, level template, and press enter. And now that we have our level template scene, we can now add in a child, or start adding in child nodes to make our prototype grid. So right click on our template and choose add child node. And under the child node, search for the GridMap node. And you can either double click the node or click OK to add it. So now we have our level template and our grid map. Next, we want to, under our inspector, we want to load in the mesh library we just created. So click the drop down next to mesh library and then click load. Go into our assets, mesh library, and prototype grid mesh library. And you'll see now we have 2 tiles. So now that we have that in there, let's adjust a couple of the settings to make it easier to work with the grid map. These are optional, but it's how I like to work with the grid map. So under cell, we want to change the cell size to be 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. That's how we designed each of the mesh tiles to work. We want to uncheck center on X, center on Y, center on Z to center the tiles at the origin of the game level grid map. After making those changes, go ahead and press Control S or choose scene, save scene to save your changes. Next, we will place some of our meshes on the grid map. So in order to add tiles to our mesh tiles to our grid map, go ahead and click on one of them, like the floor grid, and you'll see it immediately pops up into the game scene. And then you can press either S or A. A will rotate it, D will rotate, or W will rotate. And so we want to make sure I've got this backwards. There we go. So then if I press escape and I hold down right click, you can move around with WASD. And we can see there we've got our first tile in. And now we want to add in a wall tile. So if we click on the wall, you'll see that it's rotated. It does that when you're moving around, so I haven't found a fix for this yet. But if you just rotate, you can get it back up. Now, if I bring it over here and I click, the floor is going to go away. So what I want to do is I want to, wrong rotation. What I want to do is rotate, not around that axis. I want to use S to rotate. And so when you see the wall reversed, then you can left click to add in the wall. And you can add in as many or as few as you want. Same for the floor. You can change out your floor and rotate, but WASD, and if you're used to using WASD in playing games, then once you've placed your tiles, press escape and then hold down right click and you can use WASD to move around. And then say you want, now that you've created these walls, say you want to make a taller wall, you want to click on the wall grid, you want to, always click the wrong one, rotate it, and then choose a floor of 1, and it'll automatically put it 1 higher. And since we chose the scale of 1 meter by 1 meter. As long as your tile fits in that 1 meter by 1 meter, it will automatically be snapped to those locations. And then when you're done and you're happy with the way that the walls look and work, go ahead and press Ctrl S to save. So this will conclude our tutorial on how to create a prototyping grid mesh. And these tiles will automatically have a collision object with them, and you can very quickly go in and prototype and box out levels. And that's all there is to it. I hope you have enjoyed exploring the process of creating prototype assets for the Godot GridMap node. If you found this tutorial helpful, please leave a like, subscribe, and if you have any questions or want to share your own helpful tips, feel free to drop it in the comments below. Until next time, stay creative and happy creating.